Vikings are some of the most notorious warriors in history. For centuries, they terrorized Europe and were dreaded for their savage raiding, pillaging, and conquering. Viking warriors struck terror into the hearts of their enemies with their fearlessness in the face of death, and they were equally feared for their mythical weapons, like the battle axe that fought off an entire English army. Although history remembers the Vikings as a savage group of bloodthirsty fighters, daring raiders, and intrepid explorers, in reality the majority of the Viking people in the Middle Ages were quiet, simple people, farmers and fur traders who worked tirelessly to eke out a meager living in the harsh northern landscapes of Scandinavia. Things began to change in the 8th century when the first Scandinavian kings appeared in the history books and began to organize their disparate people into more centrally controlled communities. The Viking Age officially kicked off at the end of the century in 793 AD, and the following 3 centuries would be characterized by extensive sea travel and countless raiding expeditions to foreign lands. The Viking explorers were certainly open to trade, but more often than not they'd simply take what they wanted during their barbaric raids, returning home with mountains of treasure like silver bowls and goblets taken from unlucky victims, bejeweled crosses stolen from coastal monasteries, and even human slaves to be taken back to Scandinavia and put to work. The Vikings' main goal, however, was to conquer new lands and expand their empire, with new and better lands for the Viking people to settle on. To this end, the Vikings explored far and wide, raiding the coastal areas throughout Europe, discovering the remote lands of Greenland and Iceland, and even crossing the ocean to reach the eastern coast of Canada many centuries before Columbus would have claimed to discover the New World. As the Viking Age wore on and the Vikings spread throughout the world, their wealth and power grew, and the Vikings became a much-feared specter in the minds of European peasants and nobility alike. The Vikings' already strong reverence for their warriors only grew during the pinnacle of the Viking Age, giving rise to the mysterious warrior cults that still intrigue us to this day. Legends of Viking berserkers have survived through the ages, tales of lone warriors naked but for an animal skin, fighting ferociously and without fear, often taking psychedelic drugs to block pain and fear and allow them to destroy anyone foolish enough to cross them. Perhaps the best known of the Viking warriors, the Berserkers, were said to have donned nothing but a bearskin for battle and worshipped Thor, Tyr, and Odin, the Old Norse gods of war and justice. Berserkers were often used as shock troops, sent into battle to terrorize the enemy. Their power was as much psychological as it was physical. Enemies were terrified by the Berserkers' violent rage and total lack of fear. Their battle cry was to violently bite down on their wooden shields, and Berserkers were said to have ripped off their tunics in the heat of battle to fight naked, demonstrating their lack of concern for their own safety and horrifying their enemies with their bloodlust. The Vikings may have been considered primitive and barbaric by the more cultured European peoples that they terrorized and conquered, but their weapons and fighting style were cutting edge. The Vikings possessed some of the most advanced shipbuilding technology in existence at the time. Their longships were narrow and deep, capable of holding up to 40 people and mountains of supplies or booty, and were perfect for both crossing the open seas and sailing up shallow rivers in search of settlements to plunder. Weapons were an essential part of daily Viking life and were indispensable for self-defense and plundering raids. Viking warriors did not wear chainmail, as the delicate metal would have rusted during soggy coastal raids, but this actually worked in their favor. Their lack of protective gear gave them a fearless appearance and terrified the populations that the Vikings were attacking and raiding. Instead, the Vikings relied on their infamous shields as their main defensive weapon, often standing shoulder to shoulder and overlapping their shields to form a formidable shield wall. Oddly enough, although the stereotypical Viking is often depicted in modern media as wearing a horned helmet, archaeologists have found very little evidence of these helmets, and many experts believe they were less common than we thought. As far as offensive weapons went, Vikings employed a wide variety of weapons that were common throughout Europe at the time, like bows and arrows, lances, and spears. The most elite Vikings carried swords, which were more costly to make, but common Viking warriors mainly used the notorious Viking broadaxe. These more common axes were hardly a subpar weapon. They were one of the most recognizable of the Viking weapons, and just the sight of a fierce Viking warrior carrying a bloody battle axe was enough to strike fear into the hearts of defending armies. A typical Viking battle axe was a large two-handed weapon. Archaeologists have unearthed ancient axes with wide, thin blades featuring distinctive horns at either end and a razor-sharp cutting edge nearly 10 inches long. The blade itself would have been reasonably light, weighing around 28 ounces, and they were forged using a complicated process that yielded a thin but strong blade and incorporated a stronger type of steel along the blade's edge. The blade would have been attached to the handle with a brass band, which would have shone like gold in the sun on a battlefield. The shaft itself would have been between 3 and 4 feet long, giving the weapon a large, lethal range. Viking battle axes were truly impressive and intimidating weapons, especially when wielded by a fearless and possibly naked Viking berserker. After centuries of raiding and pillaging and countless bloody battles, many Vikings had settled on English soil and lived somewhat uneasily alongside their English neighbors. Vikings had even infiltrated the Anglo-Saxon nobility who ruled England by the 11th century. But things were far from peaceful, and before long tensions would come to a head in a violent clash between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons that would mark the end of the Viking Age. In January 1066, the English king Edward the Confessor died without an heir, throwing England into turmoil. Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex and a descendant of the Vikings, was named the new King of England, but he faced stiff competition for his crown. Not only did he have to worry about an invasion from the south by the French, but he also had fierce enemies among the Vikings. King Harold of England had earned the lifelong hatred of his own brother, Tostig Godwinson, when he helped to have Tostig ousted from his position as Earl of Northumbria, and Tostig wanted revenge for the slight. Tostig formed an alliance with another King Harold, the Norwegian Viking king known by his nickname Hardrada, which meant hard ruler in Old Norse. Tostig agreed to help Hardrada conquer England in return for being restored to his earldom if they were successful. Tostig and Hardrada crossed the North Sea with 300 Viking longships and more than 11,000 Viking warriors, sailed up the Humber River and occupied the region of York. As the Vikings wreaked havoc on the people of York and solidified their hold over the area, King Harold of England had a tough choice to make. Would he stay in London and prepare for the inevitable invasion from the south, or would he travel north to deal with Viking invaders? Not one to sit around and wait, the English king roused his army and headed north to meet the Vikings. On September 25, 1066, the bloody Battle of Stamford Bridge would mark the end of the Viking Age, and the last time that Vikings attempted to conquer England. But it was by no means an easy fight for the English. The Vikings were not aware that King Harold, expecting threats to his crown, had already assembled his army, so they were taken completely by surprise when the English army appeared on the crest of the hill overlooking the Stamford Bridge, near where the Vikings had made camp. As the English army swept down the hill toward them, many of the Viking warriors found themselves trapped on the west bank of the river, and some had even left their weapons and armor on the ships, not expecting to face an attacking army so soon. As the Vikings scrambled to cross the narrow bridge to reach the safety of the east bank, the English army brutally slaughtered those caught on the west bank. Despite this early success, it would not be a swift victory for the English. The Vikings still had a secret weapon up their sleeves, a battle axe that fought off the entire English army. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an ancient historical text and one of the only sources from the period that survived to this day, the English army was nearly defeated by a single Viking soldier and his fearsome battle axe. As the surviving Vikings scrambled back over the bridge, the English army made to follow them and finish the job they'd started. But the English soldiers had to cross the narrow Stamford Bridge to reach the Vikings on the other side, and they quickly found their way blocked by a terrifying sight. As the English army bottlenecked at the edge of the river waiting to cross the bridge, a single Viking warrior had taken hold of the bridge and blocked their passage. The Viking berserker must have looked fierce to the English soldiers standing alone on the bridge facing an entire army, clothed in nothing but animal skins and carrying only a single weapon, a lethal Viking battle axe. As wave after wave of English soldiers attempted to cross the bridge, the fearless Viking cut them down one by one with his axe, buying the Vikings enough time to arm themselves and regroup on the east bank. Eventually, a brave English soldier climbed into a half-barrel upstream and floated down the river toward the bridge. As he floated under the bridge where the mighty Viking stood, he pushed his spear up through the planks in the bridge and killed the fearsome Viking warrior, but not before he had single-handedly slaughtered 40 men. Emboldened by their warrior's sacrifice, the Vikings on the east bank had formed a shield wall and were ready to meet the English when they finally crossed the river. At first it looked as though the tide was turning in favor of the Vikings, but they took a serious blow when King Hardrada was killed by an arrow to the throat. The English king offered his brother peace, but Tostig, intent on his revenge, refused. Tostig was ultimately killed in the battle, and some sources say that it was his own brother who killed him by cutting off his head. The Vikings were defeated, having lost thousands of warriors, and they returned to Norway with just 24 of their 300 boats. The Vikings would never again attempt to conquer England, and the Viking Age was over. The fighting at Stamford Bridge was so severe that 50 years later, chroniclers wrote that a great mountain of dead man's bones still lay on the battlefield. King Harold might have won this battle, but the war for his crown was far from over. And though he didn't know it at the time of his victory against the Vikings, King Harold's days were numbered. Just 3 short weeks later, the Norman invasion by William the Conqueror would mark the end of King Harold and the Anglo-Saxons too, forever changing the face of England. The Viking Age may have come to a bloody end at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but in true Viking style, it went out the way it came in, with bloody violence, fearless warriors, and mythical weapons. The legends of the ferocious Viking warriors and the battle axe that fought off the entire English army have survived through the ages and still fascinate us today. If you thought this video was fascinating, be sure and check out our other videos, like this one, called Why Were Vikings So Much Better at Fighting? Or perhaps you'll like this other video instead. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.